Let us begin with a reading from C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent because the street or the garden beyond it is opaque. How if you saw through the garden too? It is no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see. In the previous 3 lectures, we have seen how a very broad understanding of spirituality can be combined with theories of natural law and interspirituality, along with using one's own tradition as a point of departure to show how our model of spiritual direction can be adapted to those of other religious, philosophical, and ethical traditions. In this lecture, we wish to establish a template for how such a direction session might proceed. This template would eliminate any specific reference to Christianity and focus instead on the model's underlying dynamics of listening and dialogue. Those involved in the session might employ the tool of active listening developed earlier. The goal of the session would be to help directees become themselves within their own specific belief system. So let's look at the model's underlying dynamic. As seen in earlier lectures, our model represents an adaptation of the Alphonsian approach to mental prayer to the direction process. Since the model was developed within the Christian tradition, specifically the Catholic tradition, it presupposes such basic doctrines as faith in God, the Trinity, the Incarnation, redemption in Christ, and life in the Spirit. Now, as fundamental as these beliefs are to Catholics and to many Christians, they can be separated from the underlying dynamics of the model itself. And in doing so, the model can be adapted to members of other traditions without posing the threat of proselytism. The goal here is not to impose or indoctrinate, but simply to help directees come to grips with their own traditions and reach an assessment of its immediate and practical implications for their lives. So what is more, only by owning one's own tradition can a person enter into constructive dialogue with others from other traditions. Now, the model's underlying dynamics can be summarized as follows. Number 1, immersing oneself in silence. Number 2, reflecting on one's life. Number 3, getting in touch with one's feelings. Number 4, naming one's needs. Number 5, identifying the next step. And number 6, ending in silence. Taken together, these steps form a basic template that can be used in a constructive way to help directees of other traditions. So let us look at each one of these steps. Immersing oneself in silence. Silence, we have seen, is an essential characteristic of the direction process. Every session should begin in silence and end in it. Authentic dialogue requires silence. Words make sense only against the backdrop of the silence that allows them to be heard, understood, and ultimately acted upon. Without spaces of silence between them, words cannot be distinguished from one another and devolve into nothing but gibberish. For this reason, an atmosphere of silence should permeate the entire session. This backdrop of silence helps to foster a contemplative attitude towards life and allows the direction session to stand out from the other activities of the day. So this initial period of silence should last for a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And then when the directors feel that enough time has passed, they should end the period of silence simply by saying, "Let's begin." Then we move into reflecting on one's life. At this stage of the process, the silence becomes the backdrop for a conversation that follows. The main topic of this conversation should be the life of the directees and their engagement with the sacred text that they have reflected on prior to the session. And during this time, directors listen attentively to what their directees are saying and help them to get in touch with the significance of the text they have reflected on. The goal here is to help directees to find parallels between the sacred text, the sacred narrative, and the narrative of their own lives. They are to help them discover patterns and connections between the two so that the text becomes alive for them. The living voices of the dead, we might say, are meant to speak to the directees and help them make sense of their lives. Directors should not impose any particular interpretation on the directees, but seek only to elicit possible parallels between the two. From there, we move to the third stage, getting in touch with one's feelings. Once directees have had the opportunity to examine a sacred text and find its relevance for their lives, directors should gradually and very gently encourage them to move from mind to heart. They should encourage their directees to delve into their feelings and emotions about the particular text they have reflected upon. This is a critical stage in the process. Directors should be sensitive yet probing. And the goal in all this is to enable directors to look not only at the thoughts, but also at their feelings about the narrative under discussion. Directors should anticipate a wide range of responses regarding their directees' engagement with the narrative of their lives and the text that confronts them. They should seek to help their directees embrace both narratives, that of the selected text and that of their lives, and seek to uncover the hidden meaning that it holds for both of them. And then we move to the naming of one's needs. After the period of reflection and the subsequent deepening that takes place by getting in touch with and expressing one's feelings, the process moves to identifying one's needs. This entails looking at the vision or the ideal presented by the tradition in the area of moral concern and taking a hard look at one's present reality. One's needs can be thought of as the distance between the ideal presented by one's tradition and the reality of where one stands in relationship to it. One's needs can pertain to any one of a number of key factors in our human makeup: the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, the spiritual, and the social. And to name their needs that fall anywhere along this anthropological concern and then ask themselves if the gap they have identified between vision and reality is increasing or decreasing. This is what the directees are encouraged to do. And before moving to the next stage of the process, they should ask themselves if they are willing to commit themselves to narrowing the gap between the ideal and the real. Then comes identifying the next step. Once directees have committed themselves to doing what they can to narrow the gap between the ideal presented to them by their tradition and the reality of their present lives, it remains for them to identify practical steps for doing so. And at this point, directors should encourage their directees to focus not on abstract, grandiose, and largely impractical schemes, but to find small, concrete ways of moving closer to their desired goal. The gap between vision and reality will not disappear overnight, but only through a consistent program of practice involving easily realizable steps will gradually move them to closer and closer to their intended goal. And once these steps are identified, directors should help their directees to prioritize them and put them together in a prudent and practical plan of implementation. And that plan should be elicited from the directees, not imposed, and consist of small things that they believe that they can implement in a steady and consistent way. And once this has been done, we can end this session of direction by moving again into silence. As stated earlier, the direction session should begin and end in silence. Silence should also be the backdrop against which the conversation takes place. The purpose of having silence at the close of the session is to give directees a chance to gather together what has been said and begin to integrate it into their lives. And this is a time for them to gather their thoughts and feelings about what was shared. Silence speaks. It has a way of validating the session. When directors and directees close by resting in silence that surrounds them, they gather all that has been said and listen to it in a more pensive, reflective manner. And if the conversation was sincere, the silence they share will bring them a sense of peace. And if not, it will challenge them to be more open with each other the next time around. Silence marks off the direction session from the rest of life and reminds directors and directees alike that their sharing has enabled them to delve beneath appearances of things and focus on things that really matter. And by ending this way, it allows directors and directees to go back into life with a greater awareness of their need to listen both to what is going on around them and within them. Now, taken together, the above steps comprise a basic template for spiritual direction that can be used to adapt our model to those belonging to other religious, philosophical, and ethical traditions. This template should be thought of as a helpful guide rather than a method to be implemented at all times, no matter what the cost. It may very well be that some of the steps may not be covered in a single-hour session. The goal here is that over the course of time and through several sessions, directors and directees will be able to establish a rhythm in their conversations that will enable them to deal with all of these elements. Let us continue with some observations, some brief observations. To begin with, it is important that the very first session, directors and directees talk about their expectations regarding spiritual direction. In the early sessions, the spiritual direction relationship sometimes should be spent helping directees talk about their understanding or lack thereof of God, the world, and the human person. Another topic that should be addressed early on in the sessions is the directees' understanding of prayer and meditation. During these sessions, directees are typically encouraged to speak about their lives in the context of the teachings presented to them by their particular religious, philosophical, or ethical tradition. The purpose of spiritual direction is to help people become themselves in their faith. And during these sessions, directees should also be encouraged to look at just what is meant by the moral life. Finally, in the direction section, directees should be encouraged to engage the sacred texts of their particular tradition and to do so in a way that they can find meaning in them that is relevant for their lives in practical ways. To conclude, the purpose of this lecture was to show how our model of spiritual direction, although rooted in the Catholic spiritual tradition of St. Alphonsus de Liguori, can be adapted to other religious, philosophical, and ethical traditions by following a simple 6-step template that extracts the underlying dynamics of the direction process from its overt doctrinal claims. Although firmly rooted in the Catholic tradition, our model is flexible enough to assist members of other traditions in their attempt to become themselves in their faith. when used in conjunction with a broad definition of spirituality, the theories of natural law and interspirituality, as well as the encounter with the sacred texts of one's own tradition, this template can go a long way in helping those from other traditions to probe their beliefs of ultimate concern and connect them in practical ways to their everyday lives. Finally, let us have some reflection questions. How can spiritual direction based on the underlying dynamics of the Alphonsian model help those from other traditions? Do these dynamics lose anything when removed from their Catholic and specifically Alphonsian framework? Do they gain anything? What are the strengths of this approach to spiritual direction? Are there any weaknesses?